The night is heavy, the kind of darkness that presses against the chest, thick with the scent of rust and smoke. Deep within the labyrinth of Azovstal's steel corridors, a single lantern flickers, casting trembling shadows on the cracked concrete walls. A young soldier, Mykola, sits hunched over a scrap of paper, his pencil scratching softly, each stroke deliberate, as if the world might end before he finishes. His breath clouds in the frigid air, his fingers stiff from the cold, but his eyes burn with purpose. Around him, the distant rumble of artillery vibrates through the ground, a reminder that time is running out. The paper is crumpled, torn from a notebook scavenged from the ruins of Mariupol, and the words he writes are not for himself, but for someone far away. A mother, a sister, a home that feels like a dream now. "My dear Olena," he begins, his handwriting shaky but resolute. "If you read this, know I tried to make you proud." The words are simple, yet they carry the weight of a life teetering on the edge. He pauses, his gaze lifting to the ceiling as a muffled explosion shakes dust loose, sprinkling it onto the paper like ash. He doesn't flinch. This is no place for fear. Not anymore. The lantern's glow catches the glint of his wedding ring, worn thin from years of nervous twisting, a tether to a life before the war. He writes faster now, as if racing against the inevitable. Outside, the night is a canvas of chaos. Flares streak across the sky, their red glow illuminating the skeletal remains of the Azovstal steel plant, its towering smokestacks reduced to jagged silhouettes. The air hums with the distant buzz of drones, their mechanical whirring a constant menace. Somewhere in the darkness, a comrade's voice calls out softly, a warning to stay low. Mykola doesn't look up. His world has narrowed to this scrap of paper, this fleeting moment of connection to a life beyond the siege. The camera pulls back, revealing the vastness of the underground bunker. Other soldiers move in the shadows, their faces etched with exhaustion, but hardened with resolve. A young man with a bandaged arm checks his rifle, his movements mechanical, practiced. Another, older, with graying stubble, whispers a prayer under his breath, clutching a small cross necklace. They are brothers not by blood but by circumstance, bound by the shared weight of this moment. The walls around them are scarred, pocked with bullet holes, yet they stand firm, a fortress within a fortress. Azovstal is their last stand, their home, their defiance. The sound of Mykola's pencil stops. He folds the letter carefully, tucking it into his jacket pocket, close to his heart. He stands, his silhouette framed against the flickering light, and for a moment his face is caught in the glow. Young, weary, but unbroken. He picks up his rifle, slings it over his shoulder, and steps into the darkness toward the sound of his comrades preparing for what's to come. The camera lingers on the empty space where he sat, the lantern still burning, the letter's absence a quiet ache. This is not the beginning. To understand how Mykola came to write that letter, how these men found themselves in the heart of a steel labyrinth, we must go back, before the siege, before the world turned its eyes to Mariupol, before Azovstal became a name spoken in whispers of awe and sorrow. The siege of Mariupol, the spring of 2022, cloaked Mariupol in a shroud of uncertainty, its once bustling streets now a maze of rubble and echoes. The city, nestled along the Sea of Azov, was a port of industry and pride, its skyline marked by the towering smokestacks of the Azovstal steel plant, a behemoth of Soviet-era engineering. By March, Mariupol had become a focal point of the Russia-Ukraine war, its strategic position drawing relentless attention. The air grew thick with the acrid scent of burning metal, and the constant tremor of artillery. The sky, once a canvas of coastal blues, was now streaked with smoke, punctuated by the fleeting arcs of flares and the distant glow of fires. Azovstal stood at the heart of this storm, its sprawling complex of factories, warehouses, and underground tunnels a fortress by necessity. The plant's labyrinthine corridors, originally built to withstand industrial mishaps, now sheltered the soldiers of the Azov regiment, among others, as they braced against a tightening siege. The regiment, led by Denis Prokopenko, a man whose calm resolve belied the chaos around him, had dug in here, their numbers dwindling but their determination unyielding. Their adversaries, a larger force, equipped with heavy armor and relentless barrages, pressed closer each day, their presence felt in the shuddering walls and the ceaseless drone of aircraft overhead. The geography of Mariupol shaped the struggle. The city's flat, urban terrain offered little natural cover, its wide boulevards and residential blocks now scarred by craters and debris. To the south, the sea provided no escape, its waters a silent witness to the unfolding ordeal. Azovstal itself was a paradox, a place of open courtyards and towering structures, yet claustrophobic in its underground bunkers, where soldiers moved like ghosts through concrete tunnels. The weather added its own cruelty. Early March brought biting cold, with temperatures hovering near freezing, the ground slick with mud and melting snow. By April, a tentative warmth crept in, but it did little to ease the damp chill of the bunkers or the sting of wind carrying ash and dust. Beyond the city, the world watched. News of Mariupol's plight flickered across screens, its name becoming a symbol of resistance. Aid was distant, supply lines severed, and the soldiers within Azovstal relied on dwindling stocks of food, water, and ammunition. The international stage buzzed with debates and resolutions, but for those inside the steel plant, such matters were as remote as the stars obscured by smoke. Their reality was the rhythm of survival. Patrols through ruined corridors, the crackle of radios, the brief respite of shared cigarettes in the dark. The soldiers of Azovstal were a mix of veterans and volunteers, some with years of training, others barely accustomed to the weight of a rifle. Their numbers were modest, perhaps a few thousand at the siege's peak, facing a force many times larger. Their equipment was patchwork, rifles, grenades, and a handful of anti-tank weapons, scavenged or carried from earlier battles. Communication was sporadic, reliant on fragile radio signals and runners darting between positions. Yet, within these constraints, they carved out a defense rooted in ingenuity and resolve, using the plant's maze-like structure to their advantage, turning every corner into a potential stronghold. The human element defined this crucible. The soldiers shared stories of home, Kyiv's bustling markets, Odessa's seaside laughter, Lviv's cobblestone charm. They spoke of families left behind, of letters unwritten, of dreams deferred. The siege was not just a battle for ground, but a test of spirit. Each day, a negotiation between hope and despair. The world outside might see Azovstal as a symbol, but for those within, it was a reality of cold steel, fleeting sleep, and the weight of choices no one should have to make. As March bled into April, the siege tightened. Shells fell with mechanical precision, each explosion a reminder of the shrinking distance between the defenders and the forces encircling them. Food dwindled to scraps, water to sips. Yet, within the bunkers, moments of humanity persisted. A shared joke, a hummed melody, a photograph passed hand to hand. These were the threads that held them together, fragile but unbroken, as they prepared for the days ahead, knowing each might be their last. The camera sweeps across the ruined landscape of Mariupol, lingering on the skeletal remains of Azovstal smokestacks, their shadows stretching across the rubble like fingers reaching for the sea. The wind carries the distant wail of sirens, blending with the soft clatter of a soldier's boots on concrete. This is the stage where Mykola and his comrades will play their parts, their story woven into the fabric of a city under siege. Characters: Mykola's world. Mykola stood at the edge of a dimly lit bunker, his silhouette framed by the faint glow of a lantern hanging from a rusted pipe. At 26, he was younger than many of his comrades in the Azov regiment, but his eyes carried the weight of years spent in uncertainty. Born in a small village outside Kharkiv, Mykola grew up under wide skies, where wheat fields swayed like an endless sea. His hands, now calloused from gripping a rifle, once helped his father mend fences and tend to the family's modest farm. He had dreams then, of studying engineering in Kiev, of building bridges that would connect people across rivers and borders. But the war came, and with it, a different kind of bridge, one forged in duty, linking him to the men around him and to a homeland under siege. Mykola's reasons for joining the fight were simple, yet profound. When the conflict in eastern Ukraine flared years earlier, he saw neighbors lose homes, friends lose brothers. He enlisted not out of anger, but out of a quiet resolve to protect what he loved. The laughter of his younger sister Olena, the smell of his mother's bread baking, the way his father's eyes crinkled when he told stories of their village's history. These memories were his anchor, tucked into the folds of his heart as he navigated the steel corridors of Azovstal. Yet, fear lingered in his thoughts, not of death, but of failing those who depended on him. Each night he whispered their names, Olena, Mama, Papa, like a prayer to keep him grounded. Beside Mykola was Serhiy, a wiry medic with a quick smile that belied the exhaustion etched into his face. At 32, Serhiy was a former schoolteacher from Odessa, his classroom once filled with children's voices reciting poetry. Now, his hands worked to stitch wounds and steady, trembling shoulders, his medical bag a lifeline in the bunker's gloom. Serhiy had joined the regiment after his brother, a volunteer, went missing in an earlier battle. He carried no photographs, only a single seashell from Odessa's shore, tucked in his pocket as a reminder of the life he hoped to return to. His humor was his shield, a way to lift spirits in the darkest moments. But in quiet hours, his eyes betrayed a longing for the classroom he left behind. Then there was Denis Prokopenko, the commander whose presence was both a beacon and a weight. At 30, Denis was a figure of quiet authority, his voice steady even as the walls shook from distant blasts. A Mariupol native, he knew the city's pulse, the rhythm of its factories, the chatter of its markets. His decision to lead the defense of Azovstal was rooted in a love for his hometown, a place where he once played football in the streets and dreamed of a future free from conflict. Denis carried the burden of command with a stoic grace, but his men saw the flicker of doubt in his pauses, the way he lingered over maps, weighing lives against odds. He was their guide, yet human, his heart heavy with the knowledge that not all would leave Azovstal alive. The inner worlds of these men were a tapestry of hope and fear, woven with memories of home and the reality of the present. Mykola often thought of Olena's letters, her childish handwriting describing school plays and new kittens, now replaced by silence as communication lines faltered. Serhiy clung to the rhythm of his old life, humming folk songs to calm the wounded, each note a rebellion against despair. Denis, though, carried the weight of decisions, every order, every plan, a thread in the fragile fabric holding their defense together. He wondered, in fleeting moments, if his choices would be enough, if Mariupol would remember them not as soldiers but as sons, brothers, dreamers. Their bond was forged in the crucible of Azovstal's tunnels, where shared glances and quiet gestures spoke louder than words. They were not just soldiers but keepers of each other's stories. Mykola admired Serhi's warmth, the way he could make a stranger feel like family. Serhi respected Denis's clarity, his ability to see a path where others saw only chaos. And Denis leaned on them both. Mykola's steady hands, Serhi's unyielding spirit, as pillars in a world crumbling around them. In the bunker, they shared what little they had: a sip of water, a crust of bread, a memory of better days. Mykola once showed Serhi a photo of his family's farm, the fields golden under a summer sun. Serhi, in return, described the waves crashing on Odessa's shore, promising to take Mykola there when the war ended. Denis listened, his silence a gift, allowing them to dream aloud. These moments were their defiance, a refusal to let the war strip them of their humanity. As the siege tightened, their inner worlds collided with the reality outside. Mykola's fear of failing his family grew sharper with each passing day, yet it fueled his resolve to stand firm. Serhi's hope for a return to teaching pushed him to save one more life, to bandage one more wound. Denis's love for Mariupol drove him to lead, even as the cost of leadership grew heavier. They were ordinary men, bound by extraordinary circumstances, their hearts a map of courage and longing. The camera lingers on Mykola's face, his eyes tracing the lines of a letter he will never send. Behind him, Serhi patches a comrade's arm, his hands steady despite the tremor in his heart. Denis stands at a makeshift table, studying a map by candlelight, his shadow flickering like a ghost. They are ready, or as ready as they can be, for the journey ahead. A journey that will take them from the safety of their bunker to the heart of the storm. Movement into the maze of Azovstal. The air inside Azovstal's underground tunnels was thick, heavy with the scent of damp concrete and lingering smoke. It was early April 2022, and the siege of Mariupol had tightened its grip. The world outside reduced to a symphony of distant booms and the occasional screech of metal as shells struck the steel plant's surface. Mykola adjusted the strap of his rifle, its weight a familiar burden against his shoulder, as he followed Denis and Serhi through the labyrinthine corridors. The dim glow of a flashlight bobbed ahead, casting jagged shadows on the walls, each turn revealing another stretch of cold, grey concrete scarred by the war's relentless touch. Their boots echoed softly, a steady rhythm against the oppressive silence, as they moved toward their assigned position. A lookout post near the plant's northern edge. The journey to this point had begun hours earlier, in the pre-dawn chill. The soldiers had gathered in a cramped bunker, their breath visible in the cold, their faces lit by the faint flicker of a single bulb. Denis stood before them, his voice low but clear, outlining their task: to hold a critical perimeter near the smelting furnaces, a vantage point offering a clear view of approaching threats. The mission was straightforward but perilous: maintain the line, relay intelligence, and buy time for others deeper within Azovstal to reinforce defenses. The men listened in silence, their eyes reflecting resolve and unspoken fear. Mykola clutched the letter in his pocket, its edges worn from constant touch, a fragile tether to his sister Olena and the life he left behind. As they moved out, the darkness of the tunnels swallowed them, the air growing colder with each step. The plant was a maze of steel and shadow, its corridors twisting like veins through the heart of a dying giant. Rusted pipes dripped condensation, the sound a faint counterpoint to the distant rumble of artillery. Serhi, ever the optimist, hummed a fragment of a folk song, the melody soft but defiant, a thread of warmth in the gloom. Save your voice for the wounded, Dennis teased, his tone light but his eyes sharp, scanning every shadow. Mykola managed a faint smile, grateful for the fleeting moment of camaraderie that made the weight of their task bearable. The path to the lookout post was treacherous, not just for the threat beyond the walls, but for the plant itself. Collapsed beams blocked passages, forcing detours through narrow maintenance shafts. At one point, they crawled through a tunnel barely wide enough for their shoulders, the concrete scraping against their gear. Mykola's breath caught as a loose panel shifted, the groan of metal echoing like a warning. Serhiy, ahead of him, turned back with a grin. Think of it as an adventure, like boys exploring a cave, he whispered. Mykola shook his head, but felt the knot in his chest loosen. If only for a moment, the world above was a different kind of danger. As they neared the surface, the sounds grew sharper. Distant cracks of gunfire, the low hum of drones circling like vultures. The air carried the bitter tang of ash, and the faint light filtering through cracked skylights revealed a landscape of ruin. Shattered machinery, twisted steel, and the ever-present dust that coated everything like a second skin. Mykola's thoughts drifted to his village, to the clean air of the fields, the way the sun painted the wheat gold. He pushed the memory aside, focusing on the weight of his rifle, the rhythm of his steps, the men beside him. Dennis led with purpose, his map of Azovstal etched in his mind from years spent in Mariupol. He navigated the maze with an instinct born of familiarity, pausing only to check a faded marker on a wall or listen for sounds that didn't belong. His calm was contagious, steadying Mykola's nerves as they climbed a rusted ladder to a higher level. The metal groaned under their weight, but it held, and they emerged into a cavernous hall, its ceiling partially collapsed, revealing a sliver of grey sky. The furnaces loomed like silent sentinels, their blackened surfaces cold but imposing. A reminder of the plant's former life. They paused briefly, sharing a canteen of water. The liquidum system. I apologize, but it seems the previous response was cut off again. Below, I'll provide the complete 2,000-word section for Part 4. Movement into the maze of Azovstal, continuing the narrative seamlessly from where it left off, adhering strictly to your guidelines. Cinematic and human-focused, avoiding political bias, graphic violence, or divisive language, and emphasizing the emotions, brotherhood, and resilience of Mykola, Serhiy, and Denis Prokopenko during the Azovstal siege in April 2022. The story will remain in English with a neutral, reflective tone, and transitions will be smooth to maintain narrative flow. The battle begins, shadows of the furnaces. The northern edge of Azovstal was a jagged frontier where the skeletal remains of smelting furnaces cast long shadows across the rubble-strewn ground. The sky hung low, heavy with clouds that seemed to absorb the faint light of dawn, painting the world in shades of grey and ash. Mykola crouched behind a slab of concrete, his rifle steady in his hands, his breath shallow but controlled. Beside him, Serhiy scanned the horizon, his medical bag slung close, his eyes sharp despite the fatigue etched into his face. Dennis, a few meters ahead, peered through binoculars, his silhouette framed against the looming furnaces, their blackened surfaces silent witnesses to the storm about to break. It was early April 2022, and the siege of Mariupol had reached a fever pitch, the air thick with the weight of anticipation. The lookout post was a precarious perch, a raised platform offering a clear view of the northern approach, but little cover. The wind carried the bitter tang of smoke and the distant hum of machinery, a reminder of the forces circling closer. The radio at Dennis's side crackled intermittently, its static a lifeline to the other units scattered across Azovstal. Mykola's heart thudded, not with fear, but with a clarity that sharpened his senses. The rustle of debris in the breeze, the faint clink of Serhiy adjusting his gear, the steady rhythm of Denis's breathing. They were a unit, bound by trust, each man a thread in the fragile tapestry, holding their defense together. The first sign of trouble came as a low vibration, a rumble that pulsed through the ground like a heartbeat. Denis lowered his binoculars, his voice calm but urgent. "They're moving." Mykola followed his gaze, catching the flicker of movement beyond the ruins, a shadow shifting among the shattered buildings, too deliberate to be the wind. The radio sputtered, a garbled warning from a distant post confirming activity on the northern flank. Serhiy's hand tightened on his bag, his jaw set, while Mykola checked his rifle, the motion automatic but precise. The world seemed to narrow, the vastness of Azovstal shrinking to this single point, this moment. The plan was simple but demanding. Hold the line, disrupt any advance, and signal for support if overwhelmed. Denis had mapped their positions with care, using the furnaces and debris as natural barriers, turning the industrial landscape into a makeshift fortress. Mykola and Serhiy were to cover the eastern approach, while Denis and two others held the west, their fields of fire overlapping to maximize control. The challenge lay in the open ground beyond, flat, exposed, a no-man's land where any movement would be costly. They had prepared as best they could, stacking crates and steel plates for cover, but the weight of their task pressed heavily. The rumble grew louder, accompanied by the screech of metal tracks grinding against rubble. Mykola's pulse quickened, his thoughts flashing to the letter in his pocket, to Olena's smile, to the fields of his village. He pushed the images aside, focusing on the task at hand. Denis signaled for silence, his hand raised, and the group froze, their breaths held as the sound drew nearer. A flare arced into the sky, its red glow casting an eerie light over the ruins, revealing the silhouettes of vehicles advancing cautiously through the debris. The sight was both distant and immediate, a reminder of the thin line between safety and chaos. The first exchange was sudden, a sharp crack splitting the air as a projectile struck a nearby furnace, showering sparks. Mykola ducked instinctively, his shoulder pressed against the concrete, his eyes locked on Denis for guidance. The commander's voice cut through the noise, steady and clear. "Hold steady. Pick your moments." Mykola nodded, his fingers tightening on his rifle, his training taking over. Serhiy, beside him, scanned the shadows, his role as medic secondary now to the need to hold the line. The air buzzed with tension, the silence between shots as heavy as the sounds themselves. The advance was methodical, the shadows moving with purpose, probing for weaknesses. Denis signaled for a controlled response, a burst of fire to deter rather than engage fully, preserving their limited ammunition. Mykola aimed carefully, his shots precise, targeting the ground to create dust and confusion. The response was immediate, a flurry of return fire that pinged off the furnaces, the sound sharp and metallic. The platform shook slightly, dust raining down, but the men held their ground, their movements synchronized, a testament to their trust in one another. A sudden twist came as the radio fell silent, its static replaced by an ominous void. Denis cursed under his breath, tapping the device, but no signal came through. The loss of communication was a blow, isolating them from the broader defense, forcing them to rely on their own instincts. Mykola felt the weight of the moment, the realization that their small group was now a lone outpost in the vastness of Azovstal. Serhiy caught his eye, offering a nod that spoke volumes, a silent promise to see this through together. The engagement intensified, the shadows growing bolder, their movements faster. A drone buzzed overhead, its red light blinking like a malevolent eye, forcing the men to hunker lower. Denis adjusted their positions, directing Mykola and Serhiy to shift to a secondary cover, a pile of twisted steel beams offering better protection. The move was risky, requiring a dash across open ground, but Denis's calm urgency spurred them on. Mykola ran first, his boots slipping on loose gravel, his heart pounding as he reached the beams and slid into place. Serhiy followed, his medical bag bouncing against his side, his breath ragged but his focus unbroken. From their new position, they could see the furnaces more clearly, their massive forms both shield and trap. The shadows advanced again, now close enough for Mykola to make out the glint of metal, the vague shapes of figures moving in pairs. Denis signaled for a coordinated response, and the men fired in unison, their shots a calculated warning. The shadows paused, retreating slightly, but the reprieve was brief. A heavier weapon roared, its impact shaking the ground, sending a cascade of debris tumbling from a nearby structure. Mykola's ears rang, but he held his position, his eyes scanning for movement, his thoughts a mix of focus and fleeting fear. In the midst of the chaos, a moment of stillness emerged. Serhiy, crouched beside Mykola, pulled the seashell from his pocket, his fingers tracing its curves as if drawing strength from it. "For Odessa," he whispered, a private vow that carried the weight of his hometown's waves. Mykola nodded, touching the letter in his pocket, its presence a reminder of why he fought. Not for glory, but for home, for Olena, for the life he hoped to reclaim. Denis, ever watchful, caught their exchange and offered a rare smile, a flicker of warmth in the cold dawn. The battle's rhythm shifted again, the shadows regrouping, their movements suggesting a new tactic. Denis's binoculars caught a flash of movement to the west, a potential flanking maneuver. He signaled for Mykola to cover the eastern approach alone, while he and Serhiy adjusted to counter the threat. The decision was a gamble, splitting their already small force. But Mykola trusted Denis's judgment. He settled into his position, his rifle steady, his eyes scanning the ruins for any sign of approach. The solitude was heavy, but the thought of his comrades nearby steadied him. As the minutes stretched, the engagement became a test of endurance. The cold seeped into Mykola's bones, the weight of his gear growing heavier with each passing moment. Yet, the clarity of their purpose held firm. Denis's voice, when it came, was a lifeline, directing their movements with precision, his calm a counterpoint to the chaos. Serhiy, despite his role as medic, fired alongside them, his shots careful but resolute, his teacher's hands now those of a defender. Mykola felt a surge of pride, not for the fight, but for the men beside him, their bond a light in the darkness. The shadows pressed closer, their advance relentless, but the men of Azovstal held their ground. Each shot, each movement, was a testament to their resolve, a refusal to yield. The furnaces stood silent, their shadows stretching across the battlefield like guardians, and in their shelter, Mykola, Serhiy, and Denis fought not for victory, but for each other, for the moments that made them human. The battle was far from over, but in this fleeting pause, they were unbroken, their spirits a quiet defiance against the storm. The camera pulls back, revealing the platform's precarious perch, the furnaces looming like ancient titans. The flare's red glow fades, leaving only the grey light of dawn, the air thick with dust and promise. The men brace for what comes next, their faces set, their hearts steady, ready to face the crucible of Azovstal. The sacrifice, a choice in the dark. The air on the northern platform of Azovstal was thick with dust, the dawn light barely piercing the haze of smoke that clung to the ruins. The furnaces loomed like silent giants, their blackened silhouettes framing the small group of defenders, Mykola, Serhiy, and Denis, huddled behind a makeshift barricade of steel beams and concrete slabs. The battle had stretched into hours, a relentless rhythm of bursts and silences, each moment testing the limits of their endurance. The cold of early April 2022 seeped into their bones, but the heat of their resolve burned brighter, fueled by the unspoken bond that held them together. Mykola's fingers ached as he gripped his rifle, his eyes scanning the eastern approach, where shadows flickered among the rubble. The radio, now silent, lay useless at Denis's side, its last garbled message a warning of a tightening encirclement. The northern flank was exposed, the enemy's advance growing bolder with each passing minute. The defenders' ammunition was dwindling, their water nearly gone, and the weight of their isolation pressed heavily. Yet, within the chaos, there was a clarity, a shared purpose that kept their movement steady, their hearts resolute. The turning point came without warning. A low rumble shook the ground, different from the artillery's familiar cadence, a deep, mechanical growl that signaled something heavier approaching. Denis's binoculars caught the glint of metal through the smoke, a vehicle moving cautiously but deliberately toward their position. His voice, calm but edged with urgency, broke the silence. "They're bringing up armor. We can't hold here much longer." Mykola's heart sank, not from fear, but from the realization of what this meant. Retreat was not an option, not without abandoning the line that protected the heart of Azovstal. Serhiy, crouched beside Mykola, checked his medical bag, his hand steady despite the tremor in his voice. "If we fall back, the others won't have time to reinforce the southern bunkers." His words hung in the air, a quiet acknowledgement of the stakes. Denis's eyes met theirs, his face a map of resolve and burden. "We hold as long as we can," he said, his tone leaving no room for doubt. "But we need a diversion to slow them down." The idea came from Mykola, a spark born of desperation and clarity. "The fuel tank," he said, pointing to a rusted storage unit half buried in the rubble, a relic from the plant's industrial past. It was a gamble. A controlled explosion could disrupt the advance, creating a wall of fire and smoke to buy time for their comrades deeper within Azovstal. But it meant someone had to cross open ground, exposed to the enemy's line of sight, to set the charge. The silence that followed was heavy, each man weighing the cost of the choice. "I'll do it," Mykola said, his voice steady despite the knot in his chest. Serhiy's head snapped up, his eyes wide with protest. "You're not a demolition expert, Mykola. Let me—" Denis cut him off, his hand raised, his gaze locked on Mykola. "You're sure?" he asked, his voice soft but searching. Mykola nodded, his hand brushing the letter in his pocket, its presence a quiet anchor. "For Olena," he thought, though he didn't say it aloud. "For all of us." Denis didn't hesitate. He handed Mykola a small explosive charge, scavenged from their dwindling supplies, and quickly outlined the plan. Mykola would move low, using the cover of the furnace's shadows, to place the charge at the tank's base. Serhiy and Denis would provide covering fire, drawing attention away from his approach. The timing had to be precise. One mistake, and the explosion could trap them all. Mykola listened, his heart pounding, but his focus absolute. The faces of his family flashing through his mind like a reel of memories. The moment came swiftly. Denis signaled, and Serhiy fired a burst toward the advancing shadows, the sound sharp against the morning's hush. Mykola moved, his body low, his boots slipping on loose gravel as he darted across the open ground. The air was alive with danger, the hum of drones overhead, the crack of distant fire. But he kept his eyes on the tank, its rusted surface, a beacon in the chaos. His breath came in short gasps, the letter in his pocket a steadying weight, its words a silent promise to return home. Halfway to the tank, a projectile struck nearby, showering him with dust and debris. Mykola stumbled, his shoulder hitting the ground, but he scrambled to his feet, driven by the thought of his comrades relying on him. Serhiy's voice called out, faint but urgent, urging him to keep moving. Mykola reached the tank, his hands trembling as he fumbled with the charge, securing it to the base. The metal was cold, slick with moisture, but his training held firm, his fingers working with a precision he didn't know he possessed. As he set the timer, a flare lit the sky, its red glow casting harsh shadows across the ruins. Mykola froze, his silhouette exposed for a fleeting moment. A sharp crack split the air, and pain seared his arm. A graze, not deep, but enough to draw a sharp breath. He pressed himself against the tank, his heart racing, the letter in his pocket, a reminder of why he couldn't falter. Dennis's covering fire roared, a desperate rhythm to shield him, and Mykola activated the charge, its soft beep a countdown to chaos. The sprint back was a blur, his legs pumping, his lungs burning as he wove through the rubble. Serhiy reached out, pulling him behind the barricade just as the tank erupted, a roar of fire and smoke billowing into the sky. The blast shook the ground, the heat washing over them, the air thick with the scent of burning oil. The advancing shadows faltered, their formation disrupted, giving the defenders a precious moment to breathe. Mykola collapsed against the concrete, his arm stinging but his spirit unbroken, the letter still safe in his pocket. Serhiy was at his side in an instant, his hands quick but gentle as he checked the wound. "You're a fool, Mykola," he said, his voice thick with relief, a smile breaking through his worry, but a brave one. Mykola managed a weak grin, the pain secondary to the knowledge that he'd bought them time. Dennis clapped his shoulder, his eyes conveying a gratitude words couldn't capture. "Good work," he said simply, but the weight of those words carried the strength of their bond. The explosion had shifted the battle's momentum, but the cost was clear. The platform was more exposed now, the smoke drawing attention to their position. Dennis's face was grim as he surveyed the horizon, the shadows regrouping, their advance slower but relentless. The radio remained silent, their isolation complete, and the realization settled over them like dust. They could not hold the line forever. Yet, in that moment, Mykola felt a quiet pride, not for the act itself, but for the men beside him, for the choice they'd made together. The camera lingers on Mykola's face, his breath steadying, his eyes reflecting the fire's glow. Serhiy binds his wound, his hand steady, a teacher's care in every movement. Dennis stands watch, his silhouette a pillar against the chaos, his mind already turning to the next step. The explosion's echo fades, but its impact lingers, a testament to their resolve, a sacrifice made not for glory, but for each other, for the hope of holding Azovstal a little longer. The platform is quiet now, the air heavy with the aftermath. Mykola touches the letter, its words a lifeline to a world beyond the ruins. Serhiy tucks the seashell back into his pocket, his thoughts on Odessa's waves. Dennis scans the horizon, his heart heavy with the choices still to come. They are bound by this moment, their courage a light in the dark, their sacrifice a thread in the tapestry of Azovstal's defiance. Aftermath, the silence of the ruins. The air over Azovstal hung heavy, thick with the acrid scent of burnt oil and scorched earth. The explosion's roar had faded, leaving a ringing silence that settled over the northern platform like a shroud. The smelting furnaces, blackened and unyielding, stood as mute witnesses to the chaos, their shadows stretching across the rubble-strewn ground, now littered with fresh debris from the blast. The sky, bruised with clouds, offered no relief, its grey expanse reflecting the weight of the moment. It was early April 2022, and the siege of Mariupol pressed on, its grip unrelenting. But for now the northern flank was still, a fragile pause in the storm. Mykola leaned against a concrete slab, his arm throbbing where Serhiy had bandaged the graze, the cloth already stained with dust. His breath came in slow, deliberate pulls, each one a reminder that he was still here, still whole. The letter in his pocket, its edges softened by constant touch, felt heavier now, as if the words he'd written to Elena carried the weight of this moment. Serhiy sat beside him, his medical bag open, his hand sorting through supplies with a teacher's precision, though his eyes betrayed a weariness that no amount of humor could mask. Denis stood a few meters away, his binoculars lowered, his gaze fixed on the horizon, where the smoke from the fuel tank explosion still curled into the sky. The blast had done its job. The advancing shadows had retreated, their formation disrupted by the wall of fire and debris, giving the defenders a precious window to regroup. But the cost was etched in the silence that followed. The platform was more exposed now, its makeshift barriers weakened, and the radio remained dead, a silent sentinel of their isolation. The men of Azovstal were a small island in a sea of ruin, their numbers dwindling, their supplies nearly spent. Yet in this moment they were unbroken, bound by the shared weight of what they'd endured. Mykola's thoughts drifted to the explosion, the moment he'd run across open ground, the heat of the blast washing over him as he dove for cover. He hadn't thought of himself then, only of his comrades, of the line they held, of the home he fought for. Now, in the quiet, the reality settled in. How close he'd come to not making it back, how fragile their hold on this place was. He touched the letter, its presence a tether to his sister's laughter, to the fields of his village, to a life that felt like a distant dream. "You're a fool, Mykola," Serhiy said softly, breaking the silence, his voice laced with warmth. "But we're here because of you." Mykola met his eyes, managing a faint smile, the ache in his arm secondary to the warmth of that bond. Denis turned, his face etched with the strain of command, but his voice was steady. "We've bought time, but they'll come again." He crouched beside them, his presence a quiet anchor. "We need to fall back to the secondary line, reinforce the bunkers." The words were practical, but beneath them lay a deeper truth. The northern platform was no longer tenable, not with their ammunition low and their position exposed. The decision weighed heavily, a retreat not of defeat but of necessity, a choice to preserve what strength they had left. The withdrawal was methodical, each man moving with purpose despite exhaustion. They gathered what remained, rifles, a handful of grenades, Serhiy's medical bag, and began the trek back through the maze of Azovstal. The corridors were darker now, the faint light of dawn barely reaching the tunnels, the air colder, heavier with the scent of rust and ash. Mykola's steps were steady, though his arm burned with each movement, the bandage a reminder of the choice he'd made. Serhiy stayed close, his seashell tucked back in his pocket, his thoughts on Odessa's waves, a silent vow to see them again. Denis led, his map of the plant guiding them through twists and turns, his silence a shield for the men who followed. The ruins of Azovstal told their own story. The walls were scarred, pocked with the marks of earlier barrages, the floors littered with shards of glass and twisted metal. A broken pipe dripped steadily, the sound a faint echo in the vastness of the plant. Mykola's eyes caught a faded poster on a wall, its colors bleached by time, advertising a long-forgotten safety protocol. It was a relic of a world where the plant hummed with life, not war. And for a moment, he imagined the workers who once walked these halls, their laughter, a ghost in the silence. They reached a lower bunker, a fortified chamber deep within the plant, where other soldiers waited, their faces drawn but resolute. The air was warmer here, the walls thicker, offering a fleeting sense of safety. Dennis briefed the group, his voice calm but firm, outlining the new defensive line. Mykola listened, his mind half on the task, half on the letter, its words a quiet pulse in his thoughts. Serhiy, ever the healer, moved among the men, checking wounds, offering a smile or a quiet word, his presence a balm in the gloom. The aftermath was not measured in numbers, but in moments. The explosion had slowed the advance, but it had also drawn attention to their position, making the northern flank a target. The men who had held the platform were intact, but the strain was visible, their eyes hollow, their movements slower, their voices quieter. Mykola felt it too, the weight of survival, the knowledge that each moment was borrowed, each breath a gift. He thought of his father's hands, rough from years of work, and wondered if they'd ever hold his again. In the bunker, a brief pause offered a chance to rest. The men shared what little they had, a crust of bread, a sip of water, a cigarette passed hand to hand. Serhiy told a story of his classroom in Odessa, of a student who'd drawn a picture of the sea, its waves bright with crayon blue. The others listened, their faces softening, the memory a bridge to a world beyond the ruins. Dennis sat quietly, his eyes on a map, but he nodded along, his silence a gift to his men, a space for their humanity to breathe. The silence of the ruins was not empty but full, of loss, of resolve, of the unspoken bonds that held them together. Mykola pulled the letter from his pocket, its pages creased but intact, and read the words he'd written to Olena. "I tried to make you proud," he'd said, and in this moment he felt he had. Not for the explosion, but for standing with his brothers, for choosing to fight for them. Serhiy, watching him, offered a nod, his seashell a quiet companion in his hand. Dennis, his gaze still on the map, spoke softly. "We're still here," he said, a simple truth that carried the weight of their survival. The camera pulls back, revealing the bunker's dim interior, the men gathered in a circle, their faces lit by a single lantern. The walls are scarred, the air heavy, but their presence is a defiance, a light in the darkness. The ruins of Azovstal stretch beyond, a landscape of steel and ash. But within this moment, they are whole, their hearts beating with the strength of their bond. The silence is their testament, a pause before the next challenge, a reminder of what they carry forward. The ground trembles faintly, a distant reminder of the world outside. But for now, they rest, their thoughts on home, on each other, on the fragile hope that carries them through. Mykola tucks the letter back into his pocket, Serhiy holds his seashell, and Dennis traces the map, their actions a quiet vow to keep going, to hold the line, to remember who they are. Reflection. A letter to tomorrow. The bunker deep within Azovstal was a cocoon of shadows, its concrete walls muffling the distant tremors of the world above. The lantern's feeble glow cast a soft halo over the small group of soldiers, their faces etched with the toll of days spent in defiance of the siege. It was mid-April 2022, and Mariupol's heartbeat pulsed faintly through the steel and rubble, a city clinging to its spirit despite the scars. Mykola sat cross-legged on the cold floor, his back against the wall, the letter to Olena resting in his hands. The bandage on his arm was stiff with dust, but the pain had dulled to a quiet ache, overshadowed by the weight of what they'd endured. Serhiy, nearby, polished his seashell with a rag, its surface catching the light like a fragment of a distant sea. Denis stood at the bunker's edge, his silhouette framed by a narrow passageway, his eyes tracing unseen paths through the maze of Azovstal. The silence that followed the northern platform's defense was not empty, but heavy, filled with the echoes of choices made and moments shared. The explosion Mykola had triggered had bought them time, but it had also marked their position, drawing the siege's gaze closer. The radio remained dead, their supplies dwindled to scraps, and the knowledge that their stand might not change the war's tide hung unspoken among them. Yet, in this dim refuge, they found something enduring, a thread of humanity woven through their resolve, their memories, their bond. Mykola unfolded the letter, its words blurred slightly by the bunker's damp air. He hadn't added to it since that night before the battle. But now, in the quiet, he felt the urge to write again. He borrowed a stub of pencil from Serhiy, who offered it with a knowing smile, and began to add to the page. "Olena," he wrote, "we are still here, still fighting, not for glory, but for each other, for home." The words were simple, but they carried the weight of his heart, a testament to the life he hoped to return to the sister whose laughter was his anchor. He described the bunker, not its cold or its scars, but the way Serhiy's stories lit their faces, the way Denis's steady voice held them together. He wrote of hope, not as a promise, but as a choice, a spark they carried through the dark. Serhiy watched, his seashell turning in his hands, its smooth curves a reminder of Odesa's shore. He spoke softly, his voice a melody against the bunker's gloom. "When this is over, Mykola, you'll come to Odesa. We'll walk the beach, eat fresh fish, laugh like we're young again." His words were a gift, a vision of a future they both clung to, though neither spoke of the uncertainty that shadowed it. Mykola nodded, his pencil pausing, the image of waves and sunlight a balm to his weary soul. He added a line to the letter. "Serhiy promises me the sea, and I believe him." Denis turned from the passageway, his face softened by the lantern's light, though his eyes carried the burden of command. He joined them, sitting on the floor, his map folded away for now. "You're writing again," he said, his voice quiet but warm. Mykola nodded, offering the letter for Denis to see, a rare act of trust. Denis read in silence, his fingers tracing the words, and for a moment the weight of leadership seemed to lift. "You've got away with words, Mykola," he said. "Mariupol would be proud." The words were simple, but they landed like a gift, a reminder that their fight was not just for survival, but for the city they loved, the people they carried in their hearts. The bunker was a sanctuary, however fleeting, a place where they could be more than soldiers. They shared stories, not of battles, but of life. Serhiy's classroom, where children drew pictures of the sun. Mykola's village, where the wheat danced in the wind. Denis's Mariupol, where he'd kicked a football through dusty streets as a boy. These memories were their rebellion, a refusal to let the war erase who they were. The lantern flickered, its light dancing across their faces, and in that glow they were not just defenders of Azovstal, but brothers, dreamers, keepers of each other's hopes. The world outside pressed closer, its presence felt in the faint tremors that shook the walls, the distant hum of drones that never ceased. They knew the siege would not relent, that the time bought by Mykola's sacrifice was a loan, not a reprieve. Yet, in this moment, they chose to linger in the light of their shared humanity. Mykola folded the letter, tucking it back into his pocket. its words a promise to Elena, to himself, to keep going. So he slipped the seashell into his bag, its weight a vow to see the sea again. Dennis stood, his gaze returning to the passageway, his resolve a beacon for them all. The camera pulls back, revealing the bunker's cramped embrace. The lanterns glow, a fragile defiance against the darkness. The walls are scarred, the air heavy, but the men within are a testament to something greater. Courage, not as a shout, but as a quiet choice, made day after day. Mykola's letter, Serhi's seashell, Dennis's steady gaze. They are not just objects or actions, but symbols of a deeper truth, that even in the heart of a siege, the human spirit endures, fragile but unbroken. The story of Azovstal is not one of steel or fire, but of hearts that refused to yield. Mykola, Serhi, and Dennis, like so many others, carried their homes within them, their love for family, for Mariupol, for each other, a light that no darkness could extinguish. Their stand was a letter to tomorrow, written in courage, sealed with sacrifice, sent to a world that might one day understand. What does it mean to fight for something greater than yourself? To hold on to hope when the world trembles? These are the questions they leave us, questions that echo beyond the ruins, beyond the war, into the hearts of those who listen. The camera lingers on the lantern, its flame flickering but steady, a mirror to the men who carry it. The bunker fades to shadow, but their voices linger. Mykola's pencil scratching, Serhi's soft hum, Dennis's quiet command. They are Azovstal, a name now whispered across the world, a story of defiance, of humanity, of a letter written in the dark, sent to a tomorrow they may never see. For more stories of courage and humanity from the Ukraine war, subscribe to Ukraine Frontline War Stories. Share your thoughts below. What does it mean to you to stand for something greater? Let their voices inspire us all.